On October 5th, at approximately 2:30 a.m., Ukrainian forces executed a massive and coordinated retaliatory drone operation that fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the ongoing conflict. The operation targeted Russian energy infrastructure across 7 regions, with primary focus concentrated on Belgorod and Bryansk oblasts. Intelligence reports confirmed that around 260 kamikaze-type unmanned aerial vehicles and precision missiles participated in this systematic strike, marking one of the largest single operations against Russian homeland infrastructure since the war began. Multiple explosions erupted across targeted complexes within minutes of the initial wave, setting off cascading fires that destroyed critical power generation equipment and distribution networks. This devastating attack came precisely 48 hours after Russia had launched 381 drones and 35 missiles against Ukrainian facilities in Kharkiv and Poltava regions, establishing a clear pattern of reciprocal escalation. The strategic context surrounding this operation reveals months of deliberate preparation and intelligence gathering by Ukrainian forces. For the better part of a year, Russia had systematically targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure in a calculated campaign designed to weaponize winter conditions and break civilian morale through sustained deprivation. By mid-2024, Ukraine had lost approximately 1/3 of its pre-war electricity generation capacity, with damage to the energy sector exceeding $16 billion and reconstruction costs estimated to reach $68 billion. Throughout this sustained assault, the Kremlin operated under a fundamental assumption that Russian territory remained untouchable and immune to reciprocal strikes of similar magnitude. However, Ukrainian intelligence had been quietly monitoring Russian energy facilities for months, methodically identifying critical nodes that supplied both civilian populations and military logistics networks supporting frontline operations. Before the October 5th strike, Ukraine had begun targeting Russian energy infrastructure sporadically, conducting what military analysts recognize as probing operations designed to test defensive capabilities and gather critical intelligence on response protocols. Each successful Ukrainian strike gradually eroded the Kremlin's narrative of territorial immunity and demonstrated a crucial vulnerability in Russian strategic planning. Moscow's vast geography, traditionally considered an insurmountable strategic advantage providing defense in depth, was beginning to reveal itself as a potential defensive liability when confronted with distributed drone warfare. Russia's sophisticated air defense systems were stretched dangerously thin across thousands of kilometers, attempting to simultaneously protect frontline positions, occupied Crimea, the capital city of Moscow, and numerous strategic assets spread across the homeland. Ukrainian military planners recognized this overextension and understood that systematic pressure on homeland infrastructure would force Russian commanders into impossible resource allocation decisions, creating a strategic dilemma with no satisfactory solution. The October 5th operation represented the culmination of this evolving doctrine, demonstrating Ukraine's capability to inflict systematic, coordinated damage on Russian homeland infrastructure while maintaining operational security and achieving tactical surprise. The strike was carefully designed as part of Ukraine's deep strike doctrine, utilizing multiple approach vectors to overwhelm regional air defenses and achieve maximum destructive effect against high-value targets that would create cascading failures throughout the Russian logistics and support network. On the night of October 5th, Ukrainian forces launched the energy operation with precision timing and multi-directional coordination that overwhelmed Russian defensive capabilities. Drone waves approached target areas from multiple vectors simultaneously, a tactical decision that fragmented Russian air defense response and prevented effective concentration of interceptor assets. The 60-megawatt Luch thermal power plant in Belgorod, which provided 36.3% of the city's heating capacity, became the primary target of this sophisticated operation. Video documentation confirmed at least 5 separate precision munitions striking the facility within a concentrated time frame, ensuring complete destruction of critical components. In Bryansk Oblast, the 110 kilovolt transformer complex at Klintsy thermal plant sustained hits from multiple drones in coordinated succession. Secondary explosions that followed the initial strikes confirmed catastrophic destruction of transformers, turbine units, and essential distribution infrastructure that formed the backbone of regional power supply. Open-source intelligence analysts successfully geolocated civilian footage captured during and immediately after the strikes, providing independent verification of targeting accuracy and damage assessment. NASA firm's satellite data revealed sustained heat anomalies at strike locations lasting for hours after the initial attacks, indicating uncontrolled fires and ongoing destruction of infrastructure components. The loss of the Luch thermal plant alone removed more than one-third of Belgorod's total power generation capacity in a single operation. Extensive fires destroyed turbine systems that had been modernized in 2007 using General Electric technology, representing significant capital investment and sophisticated equipment that cannot be rapidly replaced. The strikes also eliminated transformer stations that distributed electricity to military bases and logistics centers supporting frontline operations, directly impacting Russian combat capabilities. Within hours of the strikes, power disruptions spread rapidly across affected regions, creating cascading failures throughout interconnected systems. Reports from local sources indicated that over 42,000 residents lost electricity in Belgorod alone, while a total of 24 settlements were plunged into complete darkness. Water pumping systems failed across the region as electrical supply collapsed, creating immediate humanitarian concerns. Russian defensive response proved inadequate to prevent the strikes or contain their consequences. Following the attack, emergency power rationing was introduced across all affected regions in a desperate attempt to manage remaining capacity. Regional Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov confirmed significant power outages in public statements, but made a startling admission that revealed the depth of the crisis. Missile threat warning systems might malfunction due to electrical failures, leaving civilian populations without advance notice of incoming attacks. State-controlled media attempted to downplay the incidents, characterizing them merely as fires without acknowledging the military nature of the strikes or their strategic implications. However, independent monitors and civilian documentation confirmed major structural damage that contradicted official narratives. Communication systems around strike sites reportedly experienced severe disruptions during the attacks, significantly limiting coordination capabilities of both defense units and emergency response teams. This communication breakdown compounded the crisis, preventing effective damage control and leaving affected populations isolated and uninformed about the evolving situation and safety protocols they should follow. Power shortages rapidly affected civilian infrastructure across the targeted regions, creating a cascade of failures that brought normal life to a complete standstill within hours. Traffic lights failed throughout urban centers, creating immediate gridlock and transportation paralysis within minutes of the initial power loss. Hundreds of civilians were trapped in elevator shafts across residential and commercial buildings, requiring emergency rescue operations that strained already overwhelmed response capabilities. Water supply systems stopped functioning as electrical pumps went offline, leaving entire communities without access to potable water or sanitation services. Mobile network infrastructure and internet systems collapsed simultaneously, severing information flows and isolating affected populations from external communication. Hospitals and police stations were forced to switch to emergency backup generators, with fuel supplies immediately becoming critical concerns as officials recognized that prolonged outages would quickly exhaust reserves. Payment systems dependent on electrical infrastructure failed completely, forcing affected regions to revert to cash-only transactions and disrupting commercial activity across all sectors. Agricultural operations ground to a halt as processing facilities lost power, threatening food production chains and creating potential supply disruptions. The situation rapidly evolved beyond a simple infrastructure strike into a broader systemic crisis, affecting every aspect of basic services across border regions. The speed and comprehensiveness of this collapse demonstrated the profound vulnerability of modern civilian infrastructure to targeted military operations against power generation and distribution networks. Russia's air defense network, already stretched across thousands of kilometers of frontline and strategic territory, proved fundamentally incapable of adequately protecting homeland infrastructure while simultaneously maintaining frontline coverage against Ukrainian operations. Every S-400 or Pantsir S-1 battery redeployed to protect inland facilities created immediate vulnerabilities at forward positions, forcing Russian commanders into zero-sum defensive calculations with no favorable outcomes. Ukraine's mobile launch platforms, including HIMARS batteries and distributed drone teams, could relocate within minutes after conducting strikes, making preemptive counterstrikes nearly impossible to execute effectively. With major transport routes supporting military logistics now threatened by widespread power disruptions, Russian supply operations faced mounting complications that directly impacted combat effectiveness at the front lines. The systematic targeting created an interconnected energy and logistical crisis that rippled across military operations throughout the theater. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky had previously described ongoing operations as integral components of a comprehensive deep strike campaign, specifically targeting Russia's logistics and support infrastructure, rather than engaging in direct combat operations alone. Over recent months, dozens of refineries, fuel depots, ammunition storage facilities, and now power plants had been struck with increasing frequency and sophistication. Military analysts assessed that this sustained campaign forced Russia into impossible defensive calculations with no satisfactory resolution. Modern military operations require reliable energy flows at every level. Tanks need fuel refineries, aircraft require functioning airfields with power, command centers depend on communications infrastructure, and logistics networks cannot function without transportation systems. Without electricity, entire logistics chains break down simultaneously, communications fail across command structures, and operational tempo collapses to unsustainable levels, fundamentally degrading combat capability regardless of frontline tactical situations. The economic asymmetry revealed by these operations proved devastating for Russian strategic calculations and long-term sustainability. Ukrainian drones costing approximately $35,000 to $50,000 per unit forced Russia to expend sophisticated interceptor missiles worth over $1 million each in defensive responses. Even successful interceptions represented substantial net financial losses for Russian forces, creating an unsustainable economic equation. Failed interceptions resulted in infrastructure damage valued at tens to hundreds of millions of dollars, plus cascading economic effects from disrupted production, halted commerce, and reconstruction requirements. Russia's already stretched defense industrial base struggled to replace sophisticated air defense missiles while simultaneously maintaining frontline ammunition production at levels necessary to sustain combat operations. The resulting financial drain compounded existing economic pressures from comprehensive Western sanctions and sustained military expenditure that had already stressed Russian fiscal capacity. The Kremlin's carefully constructed narrative of homeland security was severely undermined by repeated successful strikes on Russian territory. Public frustration grew exponentially as power rationing spread to additional regions and basic services collapsed without clear timelines for restoration. The government's demonstrated inability to prevent repeated strikes on Russian soil, particularly in regions directly adjacent to combat zones, progressively eroded public confidence in state competence and protective capabilities. Political observers noted that Governor Gladkov's public admission about non-functional warning systems represented a profound breach of the social contract between state and citizens that authoritarian regimes depend upon for legitimacy. When governments cannot provide basic security or even advance warning of imminent threats to civilian populations, authoritarian legitimacy begins to fracture at fundamental levels. Local telegram channels flooded with unfiltered civilian footage documenting destruction and chaos that state propaganda apparatus could not effectively suppress or counter. The October 5th strike was not an isolated tactical event, but rather a deliberate component of Ukraine's evolving strategic approach to asymmetric warfare. By systematically demonstrating that Russian territory was not a sanctuary immune from consequences, Ukraine established strategic symmetry that fundamentally altered the conflict's dynamics. Every attack on Ukrainian infrastructure would now generate reciprocal consequences of similar or greater magnitude against Russian homeland targets. The operation conclusively proved that systematic pressure on logistics and support systems could achieve strategic effects that direct military confrontation alone could not accomplish. Russia, which had deliberately weaponized winter against Ukrainian civilians in an attempt to break morale and force capitulation, now faced its own cities plunged into darkness and chaos with similar strategic intent. The Belgorod and Bryansk strikes definitively highlight the effectiveness of precision retaliatory campaigns in modern warfare conditions. The combination of sustained drone operations, favorable economic asymmetry, and cascading infrastructure failures has forced Russia to confront an essentially unsolvable defensive equation with no satisfactory resolution. Ukrainian forces successfully demonstrated that vast geography can transform from strategic advantage into critical liability when defending against distributed mobile strike capabilities that exploit depth as vulnerability. The ongoing campaign underscores how control of critical infrastructure, not merely territorial possession, ultimately determines strategic viability in prolonged conflict. Russia's foundational assumption of homeland immunity has been comprehensively shattered, fundamentally altering the war's strategic calculations for the foreseeable future.